Everybody from London, but I know we have a really global audience with us here today. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are joining us from. And welcome to today's webinar on government fintech adoption, what role for digital identity? I'm Siobhan Bonita, I'm a former UK civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum and its sister publication, Global Government Fintech, that serves civil servants all around the world. Now, in terms of today's topic, we're going to be discussing how governments in different countries are moving at different speeds when it comes to introducing digital identities. And often that difference in progress stems from underlying systems and approaches, including, for example, whether or not a country already has a national ID scheme in place. What we do know is that digital IDs are going to become increasingly useful, indeed perhaps crucial, for governments as they look to deliver ever more efficient and joined up public services by linking up previously separate data sets, for example. And this is particularly true as public authorities start to explore, experiment with, and adopt fintech solutions in addition to other types of public services. Now, we've got a great panel today of speakers, so we're going to be discussing all of those issues with our panel in a moment, and I will introduce them in a few minutes. But just to let you know as well that once we've heard from our speakers today, this is your opportunity as the audience to put your questions to our panel. And please do take this opportunity because you've got lots of expertise here today. So whichever device you're using, you should see somewhere on your screens a Q&A function. You can use that Q&A button from now, at any point from now on, to message in your questions. So please do that. Any question we will put to our panel, and we'll try to get through as many of those as we can once we've heard from our great speakers. So now, in terms of introducing our panel members, first we will hear from Perth Singh, who is the Executive Director of Digital Identity at the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. Perth has over 20 years experience leading digital and service delivery initiatives in various federal departments in Canada. And in his current role, he's responsible for delivering a national approach to the use of digital credentials to enable the delivery of public and private sector services. Over to Singapore to hear from Kendrick Lee, who is Director of the National Digital Identity Programme at the Government Technology Agency in Singapore. In this role, Kendrick oversees one of the 8 strategic national projects that's driving Singapore's smart nation vision, with the aim of enabling secure and seamless transactions for residents, businesses, and government agencies. Kendrick also provides his expertise to the Institute of Systems Science, the Biometrics Institute, and the Alan Turing Institute. And then last but not least, we will hear from Kazem Masali, who is Head of Digital Programs at the Chief Digital Office in the United Nations Development Programme, so giving us a slightly different perspective there. Kazem's current work entails unlocking a more equitable world by encouraging, implementing, and scaling digital public goods and digital public infrastructure to tackle global dilemmas and challenges. And she also steers the UNDP's work on inclusive connectivity and digital capacity building. So as I'm sure you'll agree, we have a fantastic panel with us here today. Please do take this opportunity to send in your questions. But without further ado, I'm going to invite Perth to give us some opening remarks. Over to you, Perth.
Thank you, Siobhan. Thanks for inviting me, and really looking forward to the conversation here with the panelists and the participants. As Siobhan mentioned, I'm the Executive Director for Digital Identity at Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat, which is the central agency within the federal government. And I'll kind of start this conversation that in December 2021, our minister every minister within Canada gets a mandate letter from the Prime Minister, essentially identifying some of the commitments that they are expected to achieve. And one of the commitments in her mandate letter was to work towards a common and secure trusted digital identity platform to enable delivery of services across Canada. And that's a really important part for Canada, or a really important event for Canada, because before that, that particular commitment had not appeared in any other minister's mandate letter. So it's very, very important. Obviously, the bureaucracy has been addressing digital identity for some time, but this is the first time I think we're really getting political attention, which is really, really important. Because this is not just a technology conversation, it's a public policy conversation. It has wide impacts, and it's important that we really look at this from a public policy perspective. So in Canada right now, we obviously do not have a national approach for digital identity, and that is one of the things we need to undertake. We also don't have a national ID card, so there's no a single card within Canada that will prove your identity, and that's important. And I'll kind of get a little bit into that as to kind of how the structure, the government structure works within Canada. So obviously we have the federal government, but we also have 10 provinces and 3 territories. And each of these jurisdictions issues different types of documents. Like in the provinces here in Canada, they issue a driver's license. The federal government would issue a passport, and so on and so on. Healthcare is also within the provincial jurisdiction. These are the documents that in the physical world, these are actual paper-based physical documents that individuals and businesses really use to prove to others as to what their identity is, what they can do, and what they can access. So they, in essence, are sort of the enablers of services, delivery of services, and also conducting transactions. We have anti-money laundering legislation, a lot of regulated sectors that must also undertake the effort to verify identities and other information of individuals and businesses. So that's important. And the reason I'm just stressing that back to that point is that there is no national ID card. And provinces, territories, the federal government issue different documents which serve as identity documents. And what does that mean for us? And the point here is that the word digital ID doesn't really have a meaning for Canada, because when you say digital ID, a lot of people are thinking, what does that mean? Does that mean that we're trying to develop a national version of an ID card? Or is this some centralized system that is going to provide identity? The end result of both those is the same, that this could be a national way of identifying individuals. And that is problematic for us because we don't have such a structure. So that term digital ID is actually not a correct term for the structure that we have in Canada. And that's an important element. So a lot of the conversations that we're having with Canadians, or some of the conversations that are happening within Canada, are expressing concerns as to what this digital ID system could look like from a national perspective. And I think it's going back to the notion of how things are working within Canada and what this could imply. And so it's very, very important, I think, to be very precise in what we're talking about, and to understand the context, or the structure of government within each country before we actually end up designing solutions. So once again, digital ID, as is traditionally known, there's really no appetite for that kind of system. So the model we're looking at increasingly is the concept of digital credentials, which very much mirrors how things work today. So in essence, there's driver's licenses, there's health cards issued by the provinces. The federal government, as I mentioned, issues temporary resident cards, permanent resident cards. There's licenses, permits for businesses. And a digital credential, also known as verifiable credential, according to the World Wide Web community language, is essentially a digital equivalent of those documents. So the model we're looking at is that we want to be able to make it much easier for individuals, for organizations to issue those important documents that can be provided to individuals that they can then use to obtain services from whichever organization that they want. It very much mirrors the physical world. And these are things that people will understand. So from some of the elements that we're in this pre-engagement sort of phase of our consultations, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But one of the things we're really stressing that this system that we're trying to develop, this national approach to digital credentials, cannot be mandatory. It has to be optional. We recognize that some individuals and businesses in Canada may not want to use such a system, and so we need to continue to maintain our paper-based systems. The other aspect over here is really emphasis on giving control of individuals' information to them so that they have the ability to whether they want to share their information or not through this particular system. Inclusivity is going to be a key point. Obviously, we're talking about digital, so we need to recognize the fact that not everybody in Canada has access to high-speed internet. Not everybody has access to personal devices, so we need to ensure what would that look like. And essentially, emphasis, this is not a central storage system. This is not a proxy for a national ID card. And that is really, really important. These are the principles that we are looking at and why we think this particular model allows that and kind of can really work for Canada. So we plan to do consultations with the public here within Canada, with governments, as well as some of our key economic sectors, really the sectors which are regulated, and as well as others, to really sort of put this model forward, get their views on what they think about this particular model, what are the concerns, what are the benefits, and how best do we design one which is inclusive, which ensures privacy, which provides people with control. And we obviously think this looking at some of the other countries that have undertaken this could really start having conversations about potentially a digital infrastructure that could be put forward, national standards, also legislation and regulations. I know some of the countries are increasingly looking at that, but that would be further down the road. I think our first step is to start those consultations, put this model forward. So lots of work to do, but we think that this model is one that could work for Canada, and we really want to put this forward to have a meaningful engagement with Canadians and be very precise on what we're talking about. And finally, I know that there is lots of work that we're doing with other countries as well. Singapore is one, UK is one, there's others, the European Commission, to also then look at like, how does this model enable cross-border services or transactions across borders? And, can the international community come together and kind of use this to deliver those type of services on a go-forward basis. So Siobhan, I'll stop right there.
Thank you so much. That's such an interesting way to start, because I think you've set out some of the key challenges that I think will be familiar to the civil servants in different countries in our audience. Really interesting what you say in terms of Canada not having a national ID scheme in place. So that's a challenge already, no foundation from which to build on, but also from a governance perspective, you have that federal structure. So that adds a complication, I think, in terms of ownership of some of these, the data sets, for example, who owns the different kind of ID systems. As well, you raise topics that I'm sure our other speakers and our audience will come back to. So citizens' perceptions of how secure the system is, how private it is, whether they're still in control of their data or not. And then what you stress there at the end, the need for consultation to kind of get buy-in from the citizen. And I'm sure as well, I see Kendrick nodding on the issue of kind of international collaboration and kind of where are we going with this on a global scale. Thank you so much, Per. Such a great way to kick off the conversation. And with that, I'm going to head over to Kendrick, where I assume in Singapore, you're on a slightly different, maybe further down the line kind of stage of your digital ID journey.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Siobhan, and thank you, Pri, for that opening. Yeah, so indeed, maybe a bit about myself, right? So I work at GovTech. I joined about 7 years ago from the private sector. I work on SingPass, on national digital identity, and I've been heavily involved in one of the products called MyInfo, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Listening to Pri's opening, I feel really fortunate that I think in Singapore we have one layer of government, right? So just one, no state, no federal. And I think we're also fortunate that we have a foundational legal identity, right? Which in a way we've sort of like digitalized that to create our digital identity, right? And I think before I start, I just wanted to recognize that every country is different in terms of context and culture, right? And I think I will share what we have done in Singapore, I'll summarize what are the key considerations. But I think, the approach each of us take will be different because our circumstances are quite different, right? So as I said, we have a foundational legal identity in Singapore. It's, a birth certificate is issued to all residents, all citizens at birth. They are issued identity cards at 15 years of age. And if you are a foreigner and you live or work here, they are issued a ID card as well. upon past approval, right? So it's on this foundational legal identity that we issue SingPass, the digital identity of Singapore, right? And it's adopted by 97% of all eligible users, right? And they make 450 million transactions last year, and it's widely used domestically for both online and in-person digital transactions, right? So essentially, it started as the digital ID you would use to transact with government, right? And that started 20 years ago. But since 2018, we've extended that for private sector use as well. So you can use SingPass to transact with the private sector, right? And more than 2,000 digital services support SingPass today across both public and private sector, right? And it's also adopted by almost all of the consumer banks and major fintechs, right? So since this topic is about fintech, right, I will just maybe share some examples of how it's being applied, right? And I think in Singapore, when we say fintech, we mean transformation of financial services through technology, and not merely the disruption of the traditional financial services through technology, right? So it's a broader interpretation. Right, so I think I'll share 3 examples. I think the first is in the area of account opening, right? So in Singapore, for low-risk customers, you want to open a bank account, it's a completely online process. There's no paper involved. It's fully digital, right? You go to the website or use the app, you choose the product, you use the SingPass digital ID to authenticate yourself and consent to the release of data, right? The form is pre-filled, you check it's correct and you submit, right? And if you're a low-risk customer, the approval is instant, and in some cases, the product provisioning is instant, which means you can get your credit card, a digital version, even if before the physical. I mean, you get a digital one instantly before the physical one comes in the mail several days later, right? In terms of open banking, right, we have the Singapore Financial Data Exchange (SG) Fintech, which has been described as the world's first public digital infrastructure to use a national digital identity and centrally manage consent, to allow individuals to access their financial information across government agencies, financial institutions, right? So this is banks, the central depository, and insurance companies. So basically what it means is that I can access my personal balance sheet across all the major financial institutions and the government pension fund on one pane of glass. Right. In terms of next step, in the corporate domain, we actually have something called Mindful Business. So it's the corporate profile data, the corporate version of Mindful, which small and medium businesses can use to open bank accounts as well as to apply for working capital loans, right? So we think this is something that can be extended upon to support ESG disclosure in support of green financing, right? So I think ultimately all of this that we are working on is really to provide a platform, a digital infrastructure that enables the flow of data across systems, organizations, and Pri talked about cross-border, right? So potentially across country boundaries as well, right? And with the consent of the data subjects, right, according to our Personal Data Protection Act, right, and based on data minimalization principles, right, in respect, so that in each use case, only the relevant data sets that are approved are assessed by the business, right? So I think from a cross-border perspective, I think some of you might be aware that we've entered into a digital economic agreement with the UK, and we're exploring the interoperability of digital identity across the country. So that would mean that, for example, a digital ID or service that's accredited against the UK Trust and Attributes Framework would be accessible, right, either by UK residents or Singapore residents using digital IDs of both countries, right? So that's, I think the next stage, given that we have achieved quite a level of pervasive implementation domestically, right? And I think ultimately there are really 3 considerations, for every country as we approach this, right? And our approach will be different. I think the first is really utility, right? I think the fact that we're having this call suggests that we all recognize that that there are benefits of having a digital ID, right? And I think to us, this is really about prioritizing sectors or use cases so that we build confidence in the system and there's widespread adoption locally. Right? So I think for us, we started with government, we moved to FIs, people have accepted that this is a better way of doing things, and they're willing to say, look, try it in other sectors of the economy, right? I think the second is trust. Trust will dictate how we actually approach this. I think for us, you look at the 2021 Alderman Trust Barometer, we have 68% rating for trust in government. We are a small market, 5.7 million people, 250,000 businesses. So I think for us, it's provided by the government. But I think for every country, it will be different, right? So for some, it may be more viable if the private sector plays a more significant role, right? And perhaps the government focusing on defining a framework, for example. Right. And lastly, as Preet has mentioned, inclusion is going to be very important to ensure that no one is left out, right? And I think even for us, even though we're 1.5 mobile phones per person, there would still be people who would say they want to opt out, for example. Right. So how do we ensure that there's a minimum level of service, right? And where it's not profitable, to provide such a service, then how does that public good, right, be delivered to the last person? Right. So I thought I'll end with that, and I think this potentially would be areas that we can discuss further in this call later. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kendrick. Yeah, that's a really good way to build on what we heard in the first presentation, because you are obviously at a much more advanced stage. So really interesting what you said, though, in that in Singapore, you did have that foundation of legal identity for your citizens already in place. So I think that obviously gave you a kind of advantage over countries that don't have that in place. Really interesting to hear what you said, though, about the percentage of take up. So 97% of the population taking up digital IDs and over 5 million transactions a year. And then in terms of kind of use cases, really interesting to hear what you say there about some of the ways that citizens can already use this to access information and services across kind of financial issues. So not just payments, because I think some countries are very much getting into payments, but you also mentioned they're kind of applying for loans, pensions, those kind of issues as well, and potentially going forward to look at the ESG and green financing agenda using some of this. And then I think linking back to what Per said as well, you've both covered the need for addressing kind of standards, especially if you're going to be doing this across international borders, getting the language right so everybody understands what we are talking about. And again, you mentioned as well the importance of building trust in this. So the more people can see the benefits, the more you can build that trust, and then the importance of inclusion as well, and making sure nobody is left behind. So thank you very much, Kendrick. Great second presentation there, and a really good point at which I think to hand over to Kazem. I think that issue of inclusion is probably one that's very dear to your heart as well, Kazem. So over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And it's really great to be here on this panel, speaking to so many colleagues, but particularly inspired by Canada and Singapore's leadership. We're here talking about fintech innovation in the context of digital identity, and that's an extremely important work at the United Nations. It's important because it's estimated that there are millions of people who do not possess proof of legal identity and thus cannot prove who they are to receive social cash transfer benefits or to really improve their livelihoods or utilize the various services that are available or could be made more available to them. And these figures of exclusion include, starts from how we look at identity from the point of view of, the 166 million children whose birth are not registered, or those without birth certificates. So really, the challenges of providing or having access to a legal digital identity is multifaceted, and they lead to, without these foundations, without these, the things that Kendrick mentioned from Singapore, it can lead to lack of access to public services and exclusion from large parts of the economy, as well as, and this is something we don't talk about as often, is the inability to exercise political rights, or to sort of exercise the right to protect your data or to have that agency over your data, and therefore the risk of exploitation, as well as, of course, as we talk about legal digital identity, the vulnerability, especially if you are a refugee, a crisis that we're seeing happen in the world as we speak, or a stateless person. So at the UN, we work together with our member states because we believe that everyone has the right to be recognized as a person before the law, and that is enshrined in the Article 6 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as Article 16 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. And I mentioned this because I think it's really important to understand the basis of the legal digital identity, and really that they are also enshrined in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which all countries have agreed to, which sets specific targets in terms of providing legal digital identity for all. And you know, that's definitely an important milestone. We believe in the ways in which we see tremendous leadership and work happening across a number of countries in terms of creating the right architecture for digital identity. One way in which UNDP is supporting this vision is by helping countries build their digital public infrastructure for identity with a digital public goods approach. Now, many of you may or may not be familiar with digital public goods, but they are open source technologies that have high relevance to the achievement of the global goals, the SDGs, and they accelerate the implementation of this digital public infrastructure for identity by speeding up implementation, because countries can reuse available code or solutions from other countries, whether it's Aadhaar from India, whether it's from Singapore. Basically, this frequently occurring use case is can lead to sort of the reusable building blocks that countries can customize to their own regional or local contexts, and therefore the digital public goods approach makes a lot of sense. It also increases the robustness because infrastructure is a moving piece. Infrastructure consistently needs to improve and be responsive to changing environments, and therefore as a digital public good, there are communities of developers, communities of governance that constantly improves them and shares lessons on implementation. The third reason why we take this approach is because we see that the importance of digital sovereignty, where countries can have ownership of their source code, also reduce risk of vendor lock-ins, are extremely important for a number of economies, and we're seeing that as a much more direct response to strengthening local digital ecosystems and creating that equality in platforms. And of course, potentially lowering the cost of implementation as well, with the sort of the shareable digital stacks around digital identity. As UNDP, we obviously recognize that this approach requires great collaboration to create the digital commons or the standards as identity is implemented, not just in national contexts, but also to facilitate cross-border trade, cross-border movements of people. And therefore, we believe that sort of putting people as well as their rights at the center of designing the systems are going to be critical, as well as the equal prominence that we need to give to the non-technology layers, such as on governance, capacities, as well as the community engagement, whether it's tech innovation hubs, whether it's local community groups at the grassroots level, to really make sure that people's grievances, people's feedback mechanisms are very much tied to how digital legal identity is thereby used as use cases, as per the treatment of data, etc., with appropriate safeguards. Now, of course, if you look at examples like what we heard from my fellow panelists, as well as examples from countries like India or Philippines that are at the moment have this tremendous vision of providing digital identity to 50 million or more people. We know that let's take the example of India, that without the digital public infrastructure and identity, something like financial inclusion that India has of 80% today would have taken 46 years to complete, as opposed to the 6 years that it has taken. And we see this happening in a number of countries where this digital public infrastructure approach to identity is shortening the time frame with which it can be leveraged to help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and address other issues of access to justice, facilitating the adoption curve for micro, small enterprises in digital commerce, etc. So the reason why, digital public infrastructure is so important in the context of fintech innovation is because the public rails or the infrastructure then really enables the private sector, the social enterprises, and other stakeholders to innovate on top of the common rails, which support, greater interoperability, greater protection of people and their rights to data. And it's therefore really important that we build these public infrastructure around the legal digital identity so that data flows from individuals are protected, that we give agencies to citizens and maximize the economic, the societal, and the governance impact that is possible, while also minimizing the potential harms in a fast-growing digital economy in a number of these countries. So, in short, as we prepare for the 77th session of the UN General Assembly in 2 weeks, UNDP, of course, along with a number of member states, are working together to highlight these very pioneering initiatives, including, of course, from countries like Singapore, and really kind of lobby together with the governments of the world to bring in this new era of country-led digital cooperation to build those safe, those trusted and inclusive digital public infrastructure. So let me stop there, Soban, and hand it over to you for questions.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Kezim. It's really good to have that perspective where you're talking, as you say, from how do you approach the issue of digital IDs when you're looking at millions of people who have no means of proving their identities. And it's a good reminder that you said that the right to a legal digital identity is already enshrined in the SDG. So it's good to have a reminder of that. But also I really like what you say, giving the Indian example of how many people they managed to get payments out to, for example, during COVID, because they introduced their digital ID system, how quickly they managed to do that in a way they wouldn't have been able to do without those digital IDs. So that real sense of the potential for huge benefits if you can do this right, but also potential for big risks when it comes to individual, especially vulnerable citizens, if there isn't that security around privacy and around how their data is used. So maximize the benefits whilst at the same time making sure regulation, standards, approvals, all of that is in place to minimize potential harms as well. So thank you so much, the three of you. I think you've really set that big global picture on everybody's on a slightly different journey here. I think there was a kind of common understanding amongst the speakers there that there are potential benefits, like big benefits if we can get this right, but not without its challenges, not without potential risks. You all touched on the issue of trust there, and that often comes up in our webinars. And I just want to go back to you once for your thoughts on to what extent do you think trust is going to continue to be a barrier to the adoption of kind of digital IDs? And what more can governments do to address this, particularly when we see, I think, increasing concerns around things like cyber attacks and government agencies, for example, being attacked and people's data potentially not being as secure as citizens would like it to be. Kendrick, I'm going to come to you first on this one, given that you already have such a high take up. Do you have to worry about trust at all in Singapore? Is this still something that you're concerned about? Do you think people are going to be wary going forward as they do more and more data sharing? Kendrick, you have to come off mute. I think you're on mute there. No, actually you're not on mute, but I can't hear you. Kendrick, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes. I'm going to go over to Perth and let's see, it might be a volume issue or something else come undone in the computer there. Perth, I'm coming over to you for this issue of trust. And I see we've got some questions coming in from Canada already, Perth, and I think some of those might be around trust issues in the system. So your thoughts on the importance of gaining trust?
To connect to Jabra, speak 510. Go to the Bluetooth menu on your smartphone and select it from the list.
Hendrik, we can hear that. We just can't hear you, I think. That's the... Perth, I'm going to come over to you.
Okay, sounds good. So trust is a big word. It means many things to many people. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, like anybody, one individual trying to interact with another individual, like trust is important, right? Like it's at the core. And you know, it was important, you know, when we first started, when sort of people started coming, you know, and kind of coalescing around cities and interacting with others. But in the services world, and when you're buying, selling, trust is hugely important. And so I think you know, one of the things that's happening is that, you know, if there's a sort of a lack of a, you know, and this is my perspective, that if there's kind of a, you know, a lack of a national approach, which is properly sort of consulted and designed, then you have essentially every player out in the economy doing what they think trust means and doing things differently. So you may, you know, some players may be very trustable, some people may not be trustable. So the system, it's as a whole has a lot less trust. So I think in the sense that when one individual is trying to verify something about another individual, they're doing it because they want to make sure that they're providing services to the right person, and the, you know, and the products that they're providing meet the requirements that they need to meet. So that's a given. The whole aspect is who needs to give that trust? Who needs to give to that trust that individual is who they say they are, and that this particular transaction, you know, meets all the requirements that it needs to meet. And I think that's where this concept of who's going to play that role, right? And that's going to be a big part of our consultation. What is the federal role in ensuring that trust between multiple parties that exist across Canada, from one jurisdiction to another with other partners? Who's going to actually say, yes, this is correct? Because if somebody doesn't say that, then it becomes a lot more, there's a lot of friction in the sort of the economy, a lot of friction in the market. Because some things may go great, like perhaps banks are more trusted, but what about the smaller companies as an example? I think we just talked a little bit about fintech. The smaller and the medium enterprises will usually have a much harder time to establish that trust. And so if we can make it easier for them, I think you have a lot more inclusive sort of participation. And I think a bigger question is that who provides that trust is a conversation that we're really going to have as we start doing our consultations.
Thanks, Perth. Hendrik, I'm going to try and come back to you now on this issue of trust. One thing that struck me in particular, what you talked about, I think when you mentioned trust in your opening presentation, you said perhaps the private sector have a slightly bigger role to play here. And I know from SingPass, people are now used to using their digital IDs with the public and the private sector. Do you think people maybe trust the private sector in a way they don't trust government, maybe?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Right, okay, great. Yes, so I was going to say that I was going to answer this in three parts, right? I think the first part on your question about whether it's important to maintain trust, I think absolutely. I think if you think about it, at least for us, digital ID started as a way for government to deliver better services to citizens, right? Both G2B and G2C. So I think maintaining that trust to ensure we can continue to do that is going to be quite important, right? And I think it's because of that trust that we were able then to extend this to the private sector, right? And I think in Singapore, if I go back to Alderman and you look at the trust level, I think government is high, right? Certain parts of private sector is relatively high, and then it depends on which sector you're talking about, right? But I think from a global audience perspective, what I would say is this: we have been studying the digital identity systems of various countries over the last one and a half years, right? And recently, with Gartner, we've sort of like tried to map where some of these people are. And if you think of a 2x2, right, in terms of government-led and business-led on one axis, right, and direct provision federation on another axis, and you overlay the digital identity schemes of various countries, actually you will find something in every quadrant, right? So for example, you would see us, SingPass in the government-led direct provision quadrant, right? You might see, some of the Nordic systems, as a mix of business-led and direct provision versus federation, and so forth, right? And then you'll see some that are in the middle, such as the trust frameworks, for example. So I think I wanted to just say as a form of encouragement that I think there will be a model for everyone, right? And I think in some sectors, so I was in the UK, for example, and I was told that there's a law that prohibits the creation of a national ID, for example, right? And in that case, then certainly the private sector potentially could play a much larger role, right? And the role of government versus the private sector will differ from country to country, for example. And then I think that's what I meant. But ultimately, from a digital economy perspective, I think everybody needs to participate, right? And I think if you ask me in terms of what's needed moving forward to maintain trust, it's also the fact that, I think in the analog world, we've all been brought up to say, look, as a child, don't talk to strangers. As an adult, don't leave your belongings unattended, right? COVID has accelerated the implementation of digitalization, and we're now doing a lot of things digitally, right? But how do we be safe in the digital space, right? Knowing that there are bad actors around who potentially would try to scam you or phish you and all those kind of things, right? So I think the next level of trust is really to then, for both government, system operators, right, digital ID operators, as well as relying parties, to then say, how do we educate users to behave in this new paradigm so that we can all be safer together? Yeah. Right. So I think I just want to say that about trust.
Yeah. Thanks, Kendra. Kazim, I'm going to come back to you on the issue of trust, because obviously you flagged kind of the potential risks around some of this, and especially with the most vulnerable people in our societies. So to what extent is trust a barrier, I think, to the adoption of digital IDs, and to what extent does the private sector play a role as well in some of these countries that you work with?
Sure. So obviously one aspect of trust is, how do we protect users that may not be average users, that may not be part of, our digital societies or digital economies, and therefore in the way in which country or regional or global norms and standards, as well as regulatory environment, really upholds that rights-based approach to their access, their use, their data is a really important way to ensure that. And we see that, when governments take that consultative approach, where civil society organizations, grassroots organizations are very much part of, sort of consultations in key policy processes, that has a remarkable impact in terms of ensuring that these issues are considered beforehand, before laws are passed, and thought of in much more comprehensive ways. But the other aspect of trust, which is much more tangible, is, how do we sort of create those, how do we create more trust through, those robust mechanisms for ensuring redressal of grievances, for, communicating what identity means for a person in terms of, their ability to use it, their ability to access it, and what happens to their data. And this is, not just, this is kind of borderlining, I think, a communications campaign, but also sort of providing citizen-centric information on this, as well as building platforms or building these systems in a way that people feel that they can register grievances, that they can get quick resolutions to those grievances. And that's a really important part of, I think, building these digital public infrastructures around identity. The last bit is, we're seeing wherever this has been done successfully, where there's, significant engagement with citizens and that building of trust, is when you think of that last mile digital centers or touch points with government and between government and citizens as being really enabled to service people's rights to access to digital identity. So really considering these digital centers as part of kind of the infrastructure or the mechanisms through which, government is able to interface with citizens.
Yeah.
But also help those that may not have, phones or connectivity to help onboard them to use the services that are being digitized, for example, to think of, sort of the combination of physical and digital that's required in a number of these contexts where there is low available infrastructure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kate. So I think you've all stressed there that importance of consultation and education for citizens, so they understand what this is about, but also, as you said there, Kazem, the ability to challenge if people feel that something isn't being done in the correct way. We do have quite a few questions coming in, so I want to pick up, it's still kind of on this issue of trust. Actually, we've got one in from Jeff Coates here, who has talked about the situation in Canada. And I think Jeff feels that it's a bit complicated at the moment with all the different, as you said, Perth, those different levels, I think, because of the federal kind of setup that you have there. But he's also raised this point about people should be able to opt out of certain things. So if they're not comfortable having all of their information, so all their medical information, maybe their medical history, they should be able to opt out of that. And you mentioned in your presentation, Perth, that everything that you do going forward should be optional. It wouldn't be mandatory to have to adopt this. So just your thoughts, all of you, on if you were to develop a kind of the perfect system, surely it would be a system that everybody has to buy into and that all of their data should be included to make the most efficient kind of services possible. But Kendrick, with what you have in Singapore, to what extent do people have control over what elements of their data are kind of connected up or not? And can people opt out of different parts of this?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, essentially the provision, I mean, the way SingPass works aligns with two very important pieces of legislation, right? The first is the Personal Data Protection Act, right, which prescribes the conditions under which data can be transferred between organizations, of individual organizations, retained and then transferred overseas, right? So I think that's one important part. And the second is the Public Sector Governance Act, right, which governs how the government would use data and how the government would share data among themselves, right? So everything aligns to these two pieces of legislation, right? And essentially, any use of the service, right, whether with government or with the private sector, falls under these acts, right? And essentially, the user has a choice, right? So if I open a bank account, I can choose to use the SingPass service, or I can choose to revert to the whatever existed before, right? Okay. I will fill the PDF form, I'll fill the web form, right? And if you choose to use SingPass, your explicit consent is sought, right? And if you don't give consent, nothing happens. The data stays as it is, and then you can go back into the manual process as what was before. All right. But of course, if you take the FI's perspective, since this is also fintech is part of the conversation, right? Then really, what does it mean, right? Is it a self-signaling that there could be certain issues that the FI needs to be concerned about, for example, or is it really someone who's just really wants to transact in a different way, right? So I think I think that's the general structure, right? And I think while I think we advocate a digital first policy, right, because it's so efficient for everyone. We don't have to have so many counters, for example. But ultimately, we recognize that there'll be people who would prefer, either by choice or otherwise, to transact physically. Yeah. Right. So we still have service centers, and in fact, what we have done is we have consolidated those service centers, right, so that we have fewer of them, but you can go to one service center and get everything done, right? So if you choose to not to go digital, you can still access the physical center, and the physical center is one stop, right? So I think while the majority have found it useful to be digital with consent, with permission, and all that, right? We still ensure that if you don't want to, you're not left out.
Yeah, thanks, Kendra. Perth, staying with Jeff's question, this issue of transparency, but also he's mentioned the different levels in Canada that you have. So I guess you're in this difficult situation where you want to maintain the provinces and the different regions having control, but ultimately that then, does that lead to quite a complicated system that maybe isn't very transparent for your citizens? Would it be easier to have a kind of national system? And also, does Jeff kind of reflect some of the challenges that you think you're going to have from citizens in terms of wanting to buy into this system?
Yeah, I mean, when I was kind of doing my opening remarks, I was really talking about, I think, the structure that we already have, and so that and we need to, our solutions need to fit within that context, with that ecosystem. We can't take it out of that, because that's not how it would be. So the model we're really looking at is, instead of centralizing information, as much as possible, information should be given to the individual. Like, I think that's the model we're saying. The individual then decides to whichever actor that they want to give their information to, but there shouldn't be this central thing which has everything about individuals. That's not the approach that we're taking. So this concept of digital wallets, whether it's your identity document, whether it's the fact that you have, a degree or a diploma from a university, whether it's the fact that you have a license to, do X, Y, Z, like all these things should be provided to the individual, and the individual then can interact with a service provider to give them the information when they want that particular transaction. So it's a very different approach that we're taking. We don't think that, I don't think that there's an appetite within Canada to have a centralized system. I mean, we talked a little bit about efficiency. Yeah, like if you look at it just from efficiency perspective, that's a different conversation, but we can't go out of Canada here. The system has to work for Canada. It has to respect what I think Canadians want. And this is why we're having those consultations. We are putting these things forward to say, okay, like what if instead of an individual providing consent to organization X so that organization X can share that information with other players, how about you take your information and then you decide? Like, it's a different model. So for us, the model is hugely important. And I think that is something that we want to put out, and it really aligns with the way things are working now, right? Like, yeah, there's a lot of different jurisdictions, but like, I mean, that's exactly what it is. When you go apply for a passport or you apply for a bank account, they won't say, give me one card. They're gonna give me 2 of the following 12. Like, they will give you an option. It's up to you which one you want to give us. So we're not going to tell you which one we accept or not. Right. And so our model needs to enable that. It can't come up with something completely new. So I think decentralized model with, instead of centralized systems, that the information should be held with the individual, is with the model we're trying to look at.
Okay, thanks. Kendrick, before I ask Kazem a similar question to this, I just wanted, there was a question in from Kevin Cunnington, I think, who asked, could you share the quadrant that you mentioned? Is that something that we could share with people who have registered after this webinar as well? Do you have something available that we could send out to people who are in the audience?
So let me come back on that, because we actually presented a slide that looks exactly like that at Identity Week Asia in Singapore this morning.
Okay.
Right. So just let me check whether we can make that available to a wider audience. I mean, we have shared already, right? So I'll just make sure that we can do it, and then I'll let you know. Yes.
Brilliant, thank you. So Kazem, this issue, coming back, this issue of kind of to what extent should citizens still be in control of their data, and to what extent should they be able to opt in or opt out of different parts of that? Just your views on that. But also I want to ask you very specifically, do you think overall digital IDs are going to be a force for good in terms of kind of inclusion and financial inclusion in particular? Or do you think there is a risk that we'll see kind of, communities dividing into people who are, who do have this and some who are digitally excluded? So what's your overall take on this?
Great question, Siobhan. I think we have a really great opportunity, especially with sort of, countries that have been part of the learning curve over the last couple of years. We really have an unparalleled opportunity to build with the world the next generation of ID systems that's going to put people and their privacy at the center. And in many ways, these principles of, putting people and privacy at the center is enshrined in these in the 10 principles on identification for sustainable development that the UN has also endorsed, along with, of course, a number of partners such as the World Bank and others. And the crux of the centerpiece really, is not so much to dictate the terms and conditions for how these ID systems should be built, but rather at the principle level that they should be non-exclusionary, that they should protect personal information, that they provide people with greater control over their data, and they respond to, various population segments, including those that, sit outside or at the peripheries of digital societies or digital economies. So I do think that it's really at the sort of at the principle level, if we were to create the kind of architecture for how identity, puts people and their privacy at the center, that would be sort of doing, that would be a force of good for the world, for sure. And as I mentioned, that all the sort of non-technology aspects that go with ensuring that, people have control, people know what their rights are. These are extremely important parts of ensuring that identity, access to legal digital identity can be a force for good.
Thanks, Kaizen. So we've had a question in from Ian Hall, who is the editor of Global Government Fintech. And obviously today's webinar wasn't just about digital IDs themselves. It was about how then might those digital IDs be utilized by government as well as the private sector to try and adopt kind of fintech solutions. So Ian has asked, from your experiences, what are the potential best use cases of how a digital ID system could enable fintech related products or inclusion, etc.? And Kendrick, he said, you mentioned at the beginning open banking, open finance applications, but Kaizen, I think you also mentioned, for example, micro businesses and how this could be used in terms of, for example, access to finances. So just your thoughts on how digital IDs might help governments with some of those kind of fintech solutions. Kaizen, I'm going to come to you first on this one.
Sure. I mean, in so many ways, and I'm just kind of trying to think of stories that I've heard or witnessed or been part of in my last 16 years in various countries with the United Nations. Every ID has a story to tell, and whether it's a trader who is let's say crossing borders to sell goods between Uganda and Kenya border, and without the access to the necessary ID, she cannot pass through regular border crossings, for example. She may have to travel longer distance to bypass that, and this leaves her vulnerable. Another example is, with respect to receiving social cash transfer benefits, the ability to self-identify who you are and therefore what benefits you are identified, you are entitled to, but going beyond, and this is where sort of the fintech innovation really comes in, the ability to then, receive that money in a way that's linked to her identity in a bank account or in a payments account, so that, this woman or this man or this smallholder farmer has a way to save their money, use it to pay digitally for, local services, pay school fees as they start getting digitized in a number of areas. So these are some human stories, but every ID has a story to tell. But if you really zoom back, it's all the things that Kendrick and Prith have also been mentioning in terms of how these systems are designed to scale. We've seen many instances where a number of countries will have 10, 15 different ID systems in place, and that's not efficient for sure. But the goal is not to centralize power, but to build, interoperable systems that do put people and their privacy at the center of how these systems interop, how these systems function, and thereby become the public rails on which the fintech innovations happen.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, certainly I think in webinars we've had in the past, the issue of digital IDs and their benefits for women in particular, and women who are starting businesses, disproportionately high benefits, I think, have been seen in terms of financial inclusion for those particular communities. Kendrick, your thoughts on where fintech innovation could really take off with digital IDs in place?
Yeah, so maybe if I can just take a step back and say, look, if you think about it from a fintech perspective, essentially it boils down to AML and CFT, right? So it's anti-money laundering and countering financing of terrorism. And I think every country has regulations around that, right? And essentially, I think digital ID solves mainly, initially the KYC problem, right? Making that more efficient, making that faster. And then subsequently, if it's used as a reusable digital ID, then ongoing authentication of the user, right? And I think, at least for us, we've been fortunate because in Singapore, the regulator had said, look, if you use SingPass for KYC, right, then it satisfies CDD, right? It doesn't say, you still have to do ECDD, but it satisfies CDD, customer due diligence, right? And that's really enabled, almost any area of consumer finance, right, to use this as a much more efficient way of customer onboarding.
Yeah.
Right. So I think earlier I talked about deposit products, I talked about the credit products, but it's gone on to include remittance, right? And I think if you think of Singapore as a country with a large migrant workforce, for example, it actually does simplify, the transfer of funds back home, for example.
Yeah.
Right. Which is a very good inclusion use case, right?
Yeah.
Of course, it also helps with digital wallets for travel, right? If you think of the more newfangled products around digital assets, it supports those as well.
Yeah.
So I think if you can solve the AML, CFT, and CDD problem, then essentially, as Kasem has said, the sky's the limit, right? There's really, no fintech problem you can't solve with digital ID.
Thanks, Kate. You're testing my knowledge there, Kendrick, of all the abbreviations there being used. Perth, maybe this is, I don't know if this is too early in Canada's journey to be thinking about digital IDs and fintech in particular, but are there kind of examples that you could give us of where this potentially would happen in Canada?
Yeah, and I think Kendrick kind of really alluded to that. I mean, the big aspect is, government set these regulations, and then you rely on these organizations out in the economy to comply with those regulations. And so if it's very difficult for somebody to comply with those regulations, such as we call them here, know your client is there, but we anti-money laundering, we have others that, that same aspect. So if you make it very difficult, it's very difficult for a small company to actually comply with those regulations. If you can make it much easier, then those services can be made readily available. And the other aspect that we're looking at is from a digital credentials perspective, like identity is just a piece of information, but what are the other things that one needs to deliver a service? And there's others as well, right? And I think the concept of digital credentials is hey, I need 5 things from you. You need to provide those things to me, and I then need to make sure that what you're telling me is truth before I can deliver you the service. If you can make that process easier, you can really enable a lot of companies that are within that space who can deliver that service. You can make it easy for an individual to go to a small company as well, because a lot of times they may not have in-person centers and they may not have all that infrastructure. So I think this aspect of looking at credentials as more than just identity, as you're saying, it's a piece of information that somebody wants, whether that's the fact that somebody is, employed somewhere, or somebody's income is certain amount, or somebody's identity is so amount. If you can easily give that to somebody, it could be trusted, you could really speed this process up. And I think that applies to fintech, medtech, almost like any small organizations out there that wants to actually change the kind of the status quo that's happening.
Thanks, Beth. I think we've got time. I can't believe how quickly the time has gone. I think we've just got time for one final question with some quick answers. And we're moving away from kind of issues around trust and those kind of issues to a more technical question that we've had come in. So this has come in from Emma Davis. And she says she's interested to understand how to protect against the risk of data kind of security while still giving individuals control of their data. So are there any innovations in the architecture itself that make it more resilient to attacks? And she said, for example, she's interested in distributed digital ledgers, and that hasn't been raised here today in the conversation. So I guess this ties into trust, because the more secure the system is, the more confidence you can give to citizens. But your thoughts on that kind of technological issue around kind of keeping the data secure and the use of kind of blockchain and ledgers technology. Kazem, I'm going to come back to you again. You're nodding here on this one.
I'm sure my co-panelists will have a much more apt response, especially on the distributed ledger part. But I do want to thank Emma for the question, because that is definitely core to trust, an aspect, a fundamental aspect that we've been speaking about today. And you know, you are raising sort of the technical safeguards that are required beyond sort of what the regulatory environment does, the technical safeguards in the systems itself. But I'd also like to kind of add to it the technical safeguards, also the operational controls, in terms of who's operating the system, at what level their sort of authorization or use are designed so that the fundamental elements of, you know, protecting people's data by design and by default is very much part of these systems. Yeah, maybe I can just hand it over to my expert panelists.
Sure, thanks, Kazem. Kendrick, you smiled there at the expert panelists, so I'm going to come over to you. Your thoughts on kind of how best to keep the data secure?
Right. So I just want to start by saying that I think even though, you know, Singapore is a government provided system, it's not exactly centralized per se, because, you know, the data is held by the respective source agencies, right? But I think maybe I just want to talk about where things are going, you know, and I think Preef sort of like alluded to some of that, right? And essentially, I think the way we're looking at digital identity is that the technology development and the user preferences suggest that the future would be one where users would expect control and users would want to exert ownership over the data. And the current technology solutions points to wallets, right? Some form of digital identity wallet. And it's likely that users will have more than one wallet. They may have a wallet, for example, a government-issued wallet where they will use for important things, and they have disposable wallets used for things that, you know, wouldn't want to be tracked, for example, right? And I think in the conversations with, you know, a previous team, as well as the teams in the UK and so on and so forth, right? I think we see three set of issues, right, around these wallets, right? And the wallets and interoperability sort of like go together, right? Because they allow one wallet to be held by a person, but be attested against different trust frameworks, right? And this morning we talked about working in the OIX, Open Identity Exchange, right? To map SingPass against the other trust frameworks of the world, right? Because that's an important part. So I think one part of it is about how the wallet interpret with other trust frameworks. The second is around the technology standards to safeguard this. And I think in our conversations, we all sort of like agreed that, you know, all shared that we are pursuing W3C DIDBC, right? So that's a frame, how it's implemented. There are many ways of implementing this, and blockchain is not the only way, right? It is one way, but there are many other ways. But I think we've also agreed this is the standard, right? And then I think the third thing that we will need to enable this interoperability would be some form of government to government type agreement. That's where we want to go, right? So I think to answer Emma's question, I think the short answer is that yes, you put it all in one place, then it becomes a concentration risk. right? So that's not a great idea, right? But I think where we are going with this is we are saying, look, you can pull various bits about yourself from various parties, from the government as one source, maybe, from say your university as another source, right? Maybe from another organization, right? As another source, and you hold it in your app, right? And then you have control over what you do. But of course, with great power comes great responsibility. And then how do I then help you or teach you, right, to take care of that app, because you really don't want to lose that, just like you want to lose your wallet on the train, for example.
Yeah. So again, interesting, coming back at the end there, you say this does rely as well on people themselves being more aware of what's happening and more educated about how they keep a lot of this safe. So, Perth, over to you for your thoughts on Emma's question around kind of keeping data secure and the technology that we might want to use to do that.
Yeah, just and I think, Kendrick mentioned the fact that, yeah, like blockchain is sort of one way of, having a kind of a trust registry kind of conversation, but there's others. But these are one of the things we're looking at, like, what's the solution which is more scalable, more resilient, more secure? I think those are the aspects that we need to really see, and it could be blockchain, it could be others. But really, I think, just stepping back a little bit, there's two things that in a distributed model you need to, that one needs to confirm. Like, one is the fact that when I get a $20, it's kind of giving an analogy here. When somebody gives me a $20 bill, like, what's the two things I'm looking at? Like, okay, is in Canada, we're like, is this issued by either Canada or some of the countries that we trust, right? Like, is it something that I can actually use this? And the second is that, has somebody actually, how easy is it to actually forge, right? Did somebody take a $20 bill and put 200 next to it? Like, those are the two things that the trust registry needs to kind of like tell us. One is that, yes, no, this was issued by the organization that you trust, and the trust has to be, I have to know that I trust that. But this is the organization that's issued it. And second thing is, it hasn't been tampered with. I think those are the two aspects we need to look at, what a trust registry needs to do. And obviously I talked about scalability and resilience and security around that. So yeah, there's many solutions. But like, I think there's a purpose here, and kind of like where we think this will go, and perhaps there are other technologies that'll come and sort of play that role.
Thank you so much. I think that's been a good answer to Emma's question, that is one possibility, but definitely not the only possibility going forward. Well, thank you so much. We have come to the end of our time. I just want to say a huge thanks to the three of you on the panel, to Kendrick, to Perth, to Kazem. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your time with us. To everybody who is watching, you might have received a questionnaire in your inbox. Please do take a couple of minutes just to give us your feedback, because it means going forward, we can give you the exactly the webinars that are most useful to you. So I'd be grateful in advance if you could do that. We will send some links to you afterwards that touch on what you have heard today in this conversation as well. And we will be sending around the video of today's conversation, so you can watch it all again or share it with your colleagues if you think it would be useful for them. And in a couple of weeks, we will also be doing a write-up of this conversation with some key points, and you will all receive a link to that as well. And also on your screens at the moment, you should see, if you are interested in kind of all things digital, we actually have an in-person event, which is quite exciting. We are now back to face-to-face kind of conferences and events. So we've got one coming up in Ottawa on the 5th of October, all about digital transformation across government. I'm sure the issue of kind of digital IDs and fintech will come up there in that event. And then our next fintech webinar is on the 4th of October, all about how AI can help authorities save money and deliver better outcomes. So all of that information is on our website if you would like to sign up for any of those. But just to say again, thank you to the audience for sending in their great questions. Thank you to the panel again, so much information there. I think it's really clear, huge potential for digital IDs, but very different, I think, states in different countries of where we all are on this journey, and not insignificant challenges and risks to overcome as well. Thank you so much, Kendrick, Perth and Kazem, and I hope to see all of you on another one of our webinars again very soon. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.